Bem-vindos a todos a este primeiro seminário deste ano. Estamos a ficar com o programa cheio daqui para a frente. Obrigada por terem vindo, principalmente neste fim de tarde, que parece ser o primeiro dia do outono. Estávamos tão bem no verão. How much do you understand of what I'm saying?
Oh,
Nothing?
sorry to disappoint, but it's just like listening to music, you know. So.
It's nice. Okay. Eu vou fazer como o nosso presidente. Uma do cravo e outra na ferradura. Não sei se assistiram a isso, mas é maravilhoso. Então, a Vita é recente no centro, é uma nova aquisição e é uma boa aquisição que trabalha em aquisição. Além disso, antes de vir para aqui, tem um percurso muito interessante com uma paragem em Londres, Kent, antes nos Estados Unidos, e trabalha com a vertente teórica e a vertente empírica e tem áreas de interesse muito curiosas para mim, porque fez jogos para aprender língua e trabalhou também em fonoestética, o que parece ser uma coisa para mim muito promissora. So thank you, Vita, and welcome. Hope you enjoy our stay with us. Her talk today will be on acquisition of the second language. So, thank you all once again.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, and thank you for having me today. I feel very privileged to join the faculty and to join the lab. So it's been very nice, and I hope I will have good, productive time here. So today I will talk a lot about phonetics and phonology. I don't know how interesting it is to you. So if you feel like you have a question, you can definitely stop me and ask your questions. We can go back. So I was told it's semi-informal, so we can definitely spend more time on some things. I try to have fewer slides, so there is an opportunity to discuss things in depth maybe. So I will talk about individual differences in the same native language and how these individual differences influence the acquisition of a second language. So I will talk about individual differences in speech, meaning oral language. So I will focus a lot on sound systems, the acquisition of the first native language sound system, second. So lots of phonetics and phonology, some terminology might come up that I will check if needs clarification. So the acquisition of L2 speech is quite difficult in adulthood. So basically from my example, you hear that I consider myself a proficient user of English, yet you still hear my accent. You know I'm not a native speaker of English. And it's quite interesting because so many times we have people who are quite fluent in foreign languages. Grammar is there, vocabulary is there, everything is nice, but they can never produce native-like output. So they can never sound like natives, no matter how much time they spend in a target country, no matter how much they spend time speaking the language. So, which basically gain L2 speech, especially pronunciation, sort of a special status in second language acquisition research. So many studies previously recognized that there is something going on about the acquisition of novel phonetics and phonology of a novel language, something special about it. Somehow it's quite difficult for us. So there is a catchy name for this, Joseph Conrad phenomenon. It's called after this English-Polish writer who was writing in English. Actually, he's considered one of the greatest English novelists. He was so good writing in English, and he learned English in his 30s, later in life. But at the same time, his entire life he had a thick Polish accent. People could barely understand him. So there is some kind of dissociation of skills. And this Joseph Conrad phenomenon is quite, relatively common, right? We do have people who sound very nice, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But most of us would always have a foreign accent if we learn a new language in adulthood. Children are different. They're a different case. So the research explains this by the interference of our native sound system. So we use existing sound categories for novel sounds. For example, if your native language has 6 sounds, like this basket with 6 compartments, then inevitably all in common sounds you will kind of sort in 6 categories, like those shelves. And once you have a novel sound, like a novel shell, your choices are limited. You only have 6 compartments. You only have 6 categories, sound categories. So what should you do if you have a different shell? So there is a tendency to kind of merge novel sounds with the existing similar sounds. So basically this novel shell will go to the most similar group of shells, which is fine. However, it's not exactly the same, right? It's similar, but not the same. And those tiny differences cause problems. Perceptual accent, accent and production, because similar is not good enough, right? And usually we do struggle with sounds that are similar, because if you have a novel sound, which is completely different, like for example, an African click, you don't have any problems with that. You would create a different category for this sound, you put it there, you know it's an African click. But when you have something like sounds kind of like Portuguese E, but not the same. So you would still assimilate it to your existing category E, and you would think it's just a weird variant of your native category E, and then once you have to produce it, it's not going to be accurate, right? So there are individual differences, because some people actually amazing at sounding native-like. So we call it exceptional outcomes in L2 phonology and phonetics. We have many cases documented when people actually are confused for native speakers just based on how well they sound. And of course, we want to know how do you do this, because we want to improve our pronunciation and perception. So we are interested in researching individual differences in L2 speech to see how we can train pronunciation, how we can improve this. Lots of factors or candidates for why some people are just better sounding. Some cognitive factors include different types of memories: phonological short-term memory, acoustic memory, attentional control, inhibition. People vary alongside these dimensions. If you have a better phonological short-term memory, you can store sounds, create better categories. But also affective factors, for example, from previous research, we know that empathy connected to better pronunciation, motivation, obviously, if you really invested in sounding native, you have better chances. Musical abilities, especially the case of opera singers, they are amazing at pronunciation. And personality, not much research on personality, but people who tend to be more agreeable for some reason also have better L2 speech skills. So lots of things, lots of variables, and as a result, some people have what we call phonetic talent. They're just so good, right? So we have these individual differences in our native language as well. It's just they're so small, they don't really affect the way we understand each other. So we kind of used to the idea that we are all competent experts of our native language. We all speak native Portuguese the same well. However, there are also little differences exist because we do process and store incoming sounds slightly different because of these individual differences. Some people have just better auditory skills, and some people don't. Myself, for example, I'm not really good at listening, general audition, right? And those differences, they do exist in native language, but we just don't notice them because there's so much less smaller differences. Then you also have different speech communities. So, for example, different dialects of Portuguese. Depending on what speech community you're exposed to, you end up having different Portuguese, right? You live in the south, you live in the north, in a different country, or maybe in your community you have lots of different people who are older or younger, children, I don't know, more women, more men. They all bring different acoustic realizations. They all speak differently. If you live in a village with 5 people, maybe the input you're exposed to are more homogeneous. If you live in an urban area, you are exposed to accented speech, you are exposed to all sorts of Portugueses, right? Because speech communities are very different. Sometimes even within one city, you have very different speech communities. The native Portuguese that you're listening to every day is slightly different from what your neighbor is listening. So when you combine your individual factors coming from you and the speech community that you live in, together the interaction of these factors create slightly different sound representations for the same L1. So even though you think you speak the same Portuguese, the way the sounds of Portuguese are stored in your psychoacoustic space, slightly different. So one person has a basket like this, another person has a basket like this. Same 6 sounds for the matter of this example. But this person has a slightly bigger category for one sound and slightly smaller category for another sound. And until recently, not a lot of attention was paid to differences in how the same native language is represented, because it was assumed that, well, it's kind of uniformal, you know? So your Portuguese is the same as my Portuguese, and we understand each other, don't we, right? However, those differences do matter. Here you have 2 native speakers of Spanish. Spanish has 5 vowels. The person on the left and the person on the right have the same 5 vowels, but their position in the mental inventory of sounds in psychoacoustic space slightly different, and the size is slightly different based on what sort of language they listen to, based on the individual differences. So a person on the left has a very tight, compact category E, maybe because this person hasn't listened or get exposed to many variants of E. Person on the right has a larger category E because in their life they listen to many different variants of E. So these differences are not significant when you speak the same language, but they might be significant when you start learning a new language. For example, you are presented with a novel acoustically similar contrast, E-U. Sounds very similar, E-U, E-U. So the person on the left would think, okay, E sounds like my Spanish E, but U sounds quite different. And they would have they would hear better difference between these 2 novel sounds because their native category E is quite compact. So the psychoacoustic space works this way that one sound would be assimilated to a native category, another sound would kind of stand apart. But the person on the right has a big category for their vowel E. So for this person, E and U sounds just like 2 incidents of their native category E. they would just assimilate both sounds in the same native category, but those are not the same. They are different in a different language. So the size of native categories might actually determine how well you will be able to recognize novel contrasts in a new language. So you end up having different assimilation scenarios based on how your native categories are represented, the placement and the size of your native categories in a psychoacoustic space. So this concept of category compactness was first introduced by Natalia Kartushina from University of Oslo, and she gave it a definition. She said, okay, phonetic category compactness is a distribution of speech sound tokens within a specific category based on individual speakers' production. So here on the left, you have a person producing multiple instances of Spanish So the blue dots are just multiple productions, and then it was possible to measure the compactness of the size of the distribution of the phonetic category So person on the left has a relatively compact category and person on the right has a bigger category And then the compactness was related or compared to how well these people can listen to novel French sounds. And the results demonstrated that, yes, compact L1 categories actually facilitate both L2 perception and production. So again, if you think about it a little bit differently, for example, your entire life, you saw all sorts of cats, many different cats. You have a very big category named, labeled cats. One day, I'll show you one of those naked cats, sphinx. I don't know how they call it, sphinx, right? And you like, it's a cat. So you have large category, you assign everything to this category, and when I show you something different, you don't really see a difference. You look, it's a cat. But if your entire life you lived with 2 brown cats, and then I show you this naked cat, you would notice the difference. You would see, oh, maybe it's a different animal. Maybe I have to develop a new category for this animal. So having tight, small categories help you to notice the difference, and there is a chance that you will create a new category for this new object, which is very important for the acquisition of L2 sounds. Because if you hear the difference, if you hear that is different from your Portuguese E, you will create a different category for this sound. You will produce it more accurately, perceive it more accurately, and chances are will be better pronunciation, perception of these sounds. So compactness is good, we want it, but how to get it, right? So I want to have compact phonetic categories. I want to hear the differences in different languages. I want to learn them and sound native. So different studies suggest that different things influence compactness. For example, Natalia Kartushina saying that it's all about individual differences in different domains. And Flaggy and Bond kind of agree. So they say, okay, people with better auditory skills probably have more compact categories. Cognitive processing probably matters. But then also they introduce such a factor as density of native system. If you speak a language like English that has, 14 vowels, your vocalic space for vowels is very crowded. So maybe your phonetic categories are much tighter, so they don't overlap. Number of languages spoken. If you speak many languages and they're all stored in one shared phonetic space, so you have vowels from German, vowels from English, vowels from Portuguese, everything together. Maybe those categories are smaller, just not to overlap. Then a most recent study saying that, well, nothing affects category compactness. it's kind of stable. If you're born with large categories, you're born with large categories, you will never hear differences, so it's not trainable. But we don't know, because category compactness was introduced relatively recently, and we really have a handful of studies on it. So my first study, I will talk about 2 studies today briefly. So we are actually coming almost to the end. So the first study basically had the same research question as previously Natalia Kartushina asked: does compactness of native categories influence L2 speech perception? But in my study, I wanted to measure perceptual categories, because what Kartushina did, she measured categories in production. She asked participants to produce certain vowels, and then she measured the ellipse, the compactness. Because I'm interested more in L2 perception, I wanted to also measure native categories in perception. So I wanted to have a different task for the participants. So I had 68 Spanish monolinguals, as monolingual as possible. It's, functional monolinguals, we call them, because people are exposed to all sorts of languages nowadays. And the tasks they did, first of all, Big Five personality inventory, so to capture their personality differences. Then they had 2 tasks for different types of memories. So for phonological memory, they had 1 task, and for acoustic memory, they had 1 task. I'm not going to describe the tasks. They're not very interesting. Then the next task, L2 perception task, was measuring how well they can recognize the difference between a completely unfamiliar language, it was Russian, and how well they can recognize the difference between bit and bit. So they had to say, okay, same or different, so bit, same, bit, different, and then they had to also, on the second occasion, they had to say how big the difference is. So 10, very different, bit is very different from bit, or 1 sounds almost the same. They were not familiar with Russian. It was a completely novel contrast for them. That's why I was 0. And the last task, I was measuring their native phonetic category for their native Spanish E, how big it is. So in order to measure it, basically what I did, I created synthesized variants of the Spanish prototypical E. All these variants was slightly off because they were altered in terms of formants, first or second. So they were kind of distributed across the psychoacoustic space. And in the center, it was a prototypical Spanish E taken from the literature, and then all around versions of E. So the variants that are closer to the prototype, they sound almost like Spanish E. But those that are further away sound more and more different. So based on how many variants participants picked as good representatives of their native E, their compactness was measured. For example, you listen into different variants, E, and every time you have to say, that's good, sounds like my Spanish E, that's good, Spanish, yeah. So also they had to judge how well it represents their native category. So somebody who has a large perceptual category for E would probably just pick all these variants and say, good enough. E is good, E is good, E is good. All these variants represent my native Spanish E. Good. People with smaller, more compact categories maybe would choose some variants closer to the prototype and then would say, the rest doesn't sound like my native E, right? So I calculated how many variants they picked, and every variant also had a value attached to it based on the distance, so it was weighted score. As a result, for every participant, I would have a compactness index or compactness score for their native Spanish E. And the results were basically that, yes, participants with more compact native categories, they are Spanish E, I only measured one category, perceive the distance between two unfamiliar sounds better. So people with smaller category E for Spanish could hear the difference between Russian E and U better than people with larger categories, which kind of confirmed the results from previous research. So it was expected. However, the effect size was quite small. So compactness did influence L2 perception, but it was significant, statistically significant result, but the effect size was rather small, which probably also makes sense because when you investigate individual differences in L1 in a native language, you don't expect huge side effects. Phonological short-term memory had nothing to do with that. So there was no effect of phonological short-term memory on L2 perception. Phonological short-term memory usually plays a role when you already kind of know a language. Then it helps you to process the sound shape of this language. But my participants did know Russian, so it was fine that this result did not really show anything. And then it was an interaction between compactness and acoustic memory. Acoustic memory is responsible for processing sounds that don't have to be linguistic. So, for example, the door is opening and this door is opening, the same or different. So acoustic memory is more about general audition, how well we can hear all sorts of sounds. And the interaction between compactness and acoustic memory is a bit difficult to explain. Usually interactions are quite hard to explain. But what happened is that participants with poor acoustic memory relied on compactness to differentiate novel L2 contrast, the Russian contrast, and participants with greater acoustic memory did not do this. So if your acoustic memory is not good, the only thing you have left over is your compactness. So if your categories are compact, then you take advantage of it. And people with good acoustic memory, doesn't matter for them if they have compact categories, large categories. Acoustic memory is great, so they just used it. And there was no connection between category compactness and any of those memories. So it seems like compactness might be just a stable factor it's a completely different concept, separated from acoustic memory and phonological short-term memory. So last study, just briefly, a few minutes, number of languages spoken. So do multilingual speakers, people who speak 2 and more languages, have more compact categories than monolingual and bilingual speakers. So if you're a Spanish speaker, you only have 5 vowels, so you can have large categories. But what if you are Spanish, Catalan, English, German, multilingual speaker? Your shared phonetic space is crowded. So you cannot have large categories, they will overlap, you will struggle. What's going to happen then? So from previous research, we know that in languages where vocalic system is crowded, like English, there is an overlap. So English speakers actually do struggle with perceiving the native English vowels. So they have to rely on contextual clues, they have to rely on secondary phonetic features like duration to differentiate, which is quite interesting, right? So to hear that people might struggle, but it's when they hear those sounds in isolation, right? They might have trouble identifying them. But for example, speakers of parsimonious languages like Spanish, they have less problems with recognizing their own Spanish vowels. So I would expect that, okay, the more languages you speak, the smaller your categories have to be to prevent you from this situation. So what we know about bilinguals is that actually when people speak 2 languages, they tend to merge their categories. if you Spanish Portuguese bilingual, your Spanish E and your Portuguese E kind of the same, so you merge them in one category. That's what we see in bilinguals. However, on the other hand, some studies demonstrate what is called dissimilarity shift, when people actually develop quite different distant categories. It's just my favorite study is on Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a study of 20 years of Arnold speaking German and English. So he begins with quite thick accent in English, and his categories for vowels in English and German, they're sort of mixed together, but as he gets older, he pulls them away from each other. So his German E and his English E are more and more distant to separate two linguistic systems. And nowadays, people say that even his German, his native German, sounds accented because of this dissimilarity shift. So some bilinguals merge their similar categories, and some bilinguals actually separate them. So which one? Well, maybe it depends. Maybe it depends on acoustic proximity. If you have two similar E's, just merge them. Maybe it again depends on individual differences. Maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't really want to sound very accented in English. Maybe he was really motivated to separate these languages. Also depends on quality and quantity of input. If you are Spanish, Portuguese bilingual, but you are exposed to very accented or not a lot of Portuguese, right? Just occasionally, then maybe you tend to develop merged categories. You just don't have enough input to separate two systems. So my question was, does the number of languages spoken influence compactness of native categories? And this time I had all shades of linguals. So I had monolinguals, I had functional monolinguals, people who were exposed to English during school but didn't really speak English. I had bilingual speakers, I had multilingual speakers. They did personality. Again, I don't talk much about personality today, but it's a big part of my research as well. They had to measure their language skills. I used self-assessment grid, so they had to evaluate their language skills, which I don't know if it's a good idea. So in order to qualify as bilinguals or monolinguals, they had to have B2 or higher in their languages. So, and I also did bilingual language profile questionnaire, so I wanted to make sure that all of them are dominant in Spanish, that their native language is Spanish, and then they have additional languages depending on what kind of speakers they are. And this time I measured 3 native Spanish vowels for compactness, so E, E, and A. So for every participant, I calculated how many phonemes, how many sounds they have in their shared phonetic space. I just combined. So basically for Spanish, Catalan bilingual, it's 11 because Spanish has 5 and Catalan 7 vowels. Even though Spanish has E and Catalan has E, but the assumption here is that those are slightly different E. The distributions, acoustic distributions, different. So you cannot treat them as the same phoneme really. So I just did the combined number. And for compactness, this time it was measured in perception, but I calculated the ellipse area, just like in previous research by Kartushina. I didn't do my complex counting weighted score thing. So the results was actually the opposite what I expected. The more vowels you have in your shared phonetic space, the larger your native categories are. So monolinguals had small native categories, functional monolinguals a little bit larger, bilingual speakers even larger, and multilingual speakers had large native Spanish categories for E, E, and A. But the significance was present only for category E. So the trend was the same for all three vowels, but only for E it was significant. So the more languages you speak, the more vowels you have stored in your mental repository, the larger your native phonetic categories are. And should be a problem, because if you have large categories, so I assume just merged categories, you should have an overlap. So if you speak so many languages, you have so many vowels, and from previous research we know that it's supposed to be shared phonetic space, right? So basically when you speak Spanish, other vowels also get activated to some degree. So if those are large categories, they all overlap, then bilingual and multilingual speakers should experience problems with perception and production. So one explanation is that maybe they also have to rely a lot on contextual clues. So lexical pool, things like this. And some studies tell us that yes, people with very crowded vocalic space, sometimes they do have to rely on other clues in the environment to understand. They have slightly different mechanisms for perception. Or maybe my participants were not proficient enough, and that's why they did the merging. So they had to self-evaluate their abilities in different languages. And usually it's a reliable measure, but who knows with those Spanish people. I don't know. Anyways, maybe I need a different, just joking, maybe I have a different measure to precisely evaluate the proficiency level in every language. Because if my multilinguals were not proficient enough in other languages they claim they spoke, then it's quite likely that they did not develop sort of a separate systems for each language. So they probably just kind of stored, merged all sorts of phonemes in just one category, so they ended up having larger categories. Also, maybe it only works for some vowels. For example, acoustically similar vowels, as Kartushina said, they do merge. So if you speak German, English, Portuguese, each of these languages, they have E and E, right? So, and quite acoustically similar, actually. So maybe only for these vowels you would merge them and you would create one large category, but for other vowels, maybe you would do something else. So I basically got more questions than results with this study, and ideally I would like to replicate it with much better design, because I still doubt that bilingual and multilingual speakers have large categories. And what a mess should be going on in their head. So it cannot be that. So I blame it on some limitations, shortcomings in the design. So anyways, other directions to explore compactness, working with more direct measures of compactness, so using EEG or eye tracking, because currently behavioral testing might not capture the tiny differences in native language that exist there. Maybe it's better to use other methodology for this. It would be interesting to see how category compactness works in atypical populations, because I suspect that maybe dyslexical speakers struggle because they have very large phonetic categories for sounds. So they have problems sampling from these categories, and I don't know. Developmental factors, what about children? We do know that there is some research about children having quite large categories that become more and more compact with age. Would be interesting to see, but it depends on how it works. So that's basically my plan, what I'm going to do in the next couple of years, I guess. Just continue investigating category compactness, looking at it from different perspectives, trying different methodology. Thank you.